When Sarah Matthews discovered a critically injured stranger in a car wreck on their property, she never imagined he would be Alexander Reynolds, the new owner of the bank, foreclosing on their family farm in just 1 week. Her selfless decision to nurse him back to health postponed her crucial job interview and left the struggling farm without its only medical professional during harvest season. But as Reynolds regained consciousness, this act of compassion was about to transform the Matthews family's fate in ways that would shock their entire community. Before we continue this incredible story, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you're moved by what you're about to hear, make sure you've hit subscribe, because tomorrow we have another extraordinary tale of fate and kindness that you won't want to miss. Sarah Matthews wiped the sweat from her brow as the afternoon sun beat down on Willow Creek Farm. At 28, her face already showed the subtle weathering that came from years of early mornings, late nights, and the constant worry of keeping a family farm afloat in an age of corporate agriculture. The 80-acre property had belonged to the Matthews family for 3 generations, but now Sarah feared they might be the last to work this land. "How's the irrigation pump looking, Dad?" she called to her father, who was kneeling beside the ancient machinery that watered their western fields. Robert Matthews stood slowly, his movements betraying the arthritis that had worsened significantly over the past year. At 63, his once powerful frame still carried the dignity of a man who had spent his life coaxing life from the soil. But recent years had bent his shoulders and added a persistent tremor to his hands. "Patched it again. But we need a new one," he replied, wiping grease-stained hands on a rag. "This one won't make it through another growing season." Sarah nodded, adding irrigation pump to the mental list of expenses they couldn't afford. Since her mother's passing from cancer 2 years ago, the medical bills had piled up alongside the farm's operating costs. As a registered nurse, Sarah had split her time between caring for her mother, helping on the farm, and working night shifts at the county hospital to keep their heads above water. But even her dual income hadn't been enough. 6 months ago, they'd fallen behind on their mortgage payments to First Regional Bank. The subsequent refinancing had seemed like a lifeline until the interest rates had suddenly doubled when the bank changed ownership. Now, foreclosure loomed, just 7 days away. "We've got the farmers' market tomorrow," Sarah said, trying to inject optimism into her voice. "If we sell everything, and I pick up an extra shift at the hospital this weekend, we might have enough for a partial payment." Robert shook his head. "Don't get your hopes up, honey. Reynolds Financial made it clear they won't accept anything less than the full amount. Corporate banks don't care about family farms or medical hardships." Sarah thought about the job interview she had scheduled at Greenfield Memorial Hospital in the neighboring county. The position offered nearly double her current salary, money they desperately needed, but it was an hour's drive each way. Taking it would mean less time to help on the farm, placing even more burden on her father's failing health. "I'll make this interview work," Sarah said, more to herself than to her father. The rural healthcare bonus alone would cover next month's payment. As they walked back toward the weathered white farmhouse that had stood since 1932, Sarah noticed her father limping more prominently than usual. The old injury from his days in the National Guard always flared up when he pushed himself too hard. "You should rest, Dad. I'll finish the evening chores," she insisted, guiding him toward the porch where her mother's rocking chair still sat, empty now for 2 years. "I'm fine," he protested, but allowed himself to be led to his favorite chair. "Just need to catch my breath." The living room walls displayed decades of Matthews family history, photos of better times when the farm had thrived, when illness hadn't drained their savings, when the threat of losing everything hadn't hung over them like a storm cloud. Sarah's nursing certificate hung beside her mother's college diploma, both symbols of the education Emma Matthews had insisted her daughter pursue. "Your skills will always feed you," her mother had said, "even when the land cannot." Sarah brought Her father, water and medication before heading to check their produce for tomorrow's farmers' market. Their stall had once been among the most abundant at the Riverside County Farmers Market, but recently they'd struggled to maintain even a modest display. The drought had affected their yields, and without proper irrigation equipment, they couldn't compete with larger operations. In the vegetable garden, Sarah carefully harvested what was ready: tomatoes, summer squash, peppers, and the blackberries that had been her mother's pride. The local restaurants once placed regular orders for their organic produce, but as prices rose, many had switched to cheaper suppliers. The farm's reputation for quality remained, but quality alone wouldn't save them from Reynolds' financial. The sun was setting as Sarah returned to the house. She prepared a simple dinner of garden vegetables and the last of Sunday's chicken. Their meals had grown increasingly spare as they directed every possible dollar towards saving the farm. As they ate at the worn oak table that had hosted 3 generations of Matthew's family dinners, Robert cleared his throat. "Sarah, I've been thinking. Maybe we should consider the offer from Westland Agriculture." Sarah put down her fork. "Dad, they want to turn this into corporate farmland. Everything Mom and Grandpa built would disappear." "I know," Robert sighed, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. "But at least we'd have enough to get you settled somewhere else. The medical bills from your mother's treatment. We never really recovered from that." Sarah felt the familiar ache whenever they discussed her mother's illness. Emma Matthews had fought pancreatic cancer for 18 months, her medical insurance covering only a fraction of the experimental treatments that had given them just a few more precious months together. This interview at Greenfield Memorial could change everything, Sarah insisted. The salary would let us make the payments and eventually refinance with a different bank. Robert's eyes, the same warm brown as Sarah's, held a mixture of pride and concern. "You're already working yourself to exhaustion between here and the county hospital. I worry about you driving an hour each way on top of everything else." "I'll manage," Sarah said, with the quiet determination that had gotten them through the darkest days after her mother's passing. "We promised Mom we wouldn't lose the farm." After dinner, Sarah worked on her application materials while her father dozed in his chair, the evening news playing softly on their aging television. The forecast predicted heavy rain starting around midnight, unusual for this time of year, but welcome for their thirsty fields. Sarah checked her watch. She still needed to review her notes for tomorrow's interview and prepare their produce for the early morning farmers' market. But exhaustion tugged at her limbs. Just a few hours of sleep would have to suffice. As she moved to wake her father and help him to bed, a news alert caught her attention. Breaking news! Alexander Reynolds, the new CEO of Reynolds Financial Group, is reportedly visiting the county tomorrow to review local assets, including several farms slated for foreclosure. Reynolds, who took over the regional banking chain 6 months ago, has drawn criticism for aggressive lending practices targeting family farms. Sarah turned off the television, her jaw tightening. So the man responsible for doubling their interest rates and refusing their payment plan would be in the area tomorrow, probably surveying their farm like a vulture circling its prey. "Let him come," she muttered, helping her drowsy father to his feet. "He can look me in the eye when he takes our home." As thunder rumbled in the distance, Sarah helped her father to bed before checking the windows and doors. The approaching storm matched her mood, dark, turbulent, and gathering force. Tomorrow's farmers' market and her afternoon interview now seemed even more crucial. Before retiring to her own room, Sarah paused at the small desk where bills and bank notices were stacked in neat, desperate piles. The latest letter from Reynolds Financial Group sat on top, its corporate logo gleaming under the dim light. Final notice, payment due in full. She picked up the framed photograph beside it, her mother standing proudly in front of their first certified organic harvest. Emma Matthews had believed in healing through both medicine and wholesome food, a philosophy that had guided Sarah's dual path as nurse and farmer. "We're not giving up, Mom," Sarah whispered, her fingers tracing her mother's smiling face. "Not without a fight." As she finally crawled into bed, the first heavy raindrops began to fall, drumming against the farmhouse roof like a heartbeat. Sarah fell into an exhausted sleep, unaware that the approaching storm would bring more than just rain to Willow Creek Farm. The storm arrived with unexpected fury shortly after midnight. Rain hammered against the farmhouse windows, while wind lashed the fields, bending the stalks of corn and threatening the fragile tomato plants Sarah had carefully staked just days before. Lightning flashed across the sky in brilliant streaks, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the old house. Sarah jolted awake at a particularly loud crash. For a moment, she lay disoriented in the darkness, then grabbed her phone to check the time. 2:17 a.m. The power had gone out, leaving the farmhouse in total darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning. "Great," she muttered, knowing the ancient generator would need to be manually started if they wanted electricity before dawn. The refrigerator held their produce for the farmer's market. Without power, they risked losing even that small income. Throwing on a raincoat over her pajamas and slipping her feet into rubber boots, Sarah grabbed a flashlight from her bedside drawer. She checked on her father first, finding him still asleep despite the storm's rage. Years of farm life had conditioned him to sleep through almost anything, a skill Sarah had never quite mastered. The rain hit her like a wall of water. The moment she stepped outside, the wind nearly tearing the screen door from her grip. Hunched against the downpour, she made her way to the shed where the generator was housed, her flashlight beam bobbing in the darkness. Starting the generator took 3 tries, her hands slipping on the pull cord as rain dripped from her hood. Finally, it roared to life, and Sarah felt a small measure of relief as lights flickered on in the farmhouse. One crisis averted, at least temporarily. As she turned to head back, a sound cut through the storm, something that didn't belong among the wind and rain. Sarah paused, listening intently. There it was again, a metallic groaning, followed by what might have been a car horn, brief and weak, coming from the direction of the access road that ran alongside their property. Sarah redirected her flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught nothing but sheets of rain and the edge of their cornfield. Common sense told her to return to the house, to wait until daylight to investigate. But training as a nurse had ingrained in her a response to distress that overrode caution. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the storm. "Is someone there?" Only the wind answered. Still, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The access road had a sharp curve that out-of-town drivers often took too quickly. In this weather, at this hour. Decision made, she began to wade through the mud toward the road, her flashlight barely penetrating the torrential rain. The ground was already saturated, water pooling around her boots with each step. By the time she reached the access road, she was soaked through despite the raincoat. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, as lightning flashed overhead, Sarah caught a glimpse of something metallic down the embankment on the far side of the road. She directed her flashlight beam toward it and gasped. A luxury sedan had gone off the road and rolled partway down the slope, coming to rest against one of the old oak trees that bordered the Matthews property. The front end was crumpled, steam or smoke rising even in the heavy rain. The driver's side had taken the brunt of the impact. Sarah scrambled down the slick embankment, nearly losing her footing twice before reaching the wrecked vehicle. The car was unlike anything typically seen in their rural county, a high-end model with custom wheels and tinted windows. One of those windows was shattered, allowing rain to pour into the interior. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Sarah called, shining her light through the broken window. Her heart sank at what she saw. A man was slumped over the steering wheel, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. He was well dressed in what appeared to be an expensive suit, now stained with blood and the airbag powder that filled the car's interior. He wasn't moving. Sarah tried the door, finding it jammed from the impact. The passenger door was blocked by the tree. She would have to go through the broken window. "Sir, I'm a nurse. I'm going to help you," she said loudly, though she doubted he could hear her. Years of emergency room experience took over as Sarah carefully reached through the window, avoiding the shards of glass. She pressed her fingers to the man's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak but present. With practiced movements, Sarah assessed his condition as best she could through the window. Head trauma, possible internal injuries from the impact, risk of hypothermia in the cold rain. He needed immediate medical attention, but the nearest hospital was 30 minutes away in good weather. In this storm, with the rural roads likely flooding in places, Sarah made a rapid calculation. Moving him was risky, but leaving him exposed to the elements was potentially fatal. Her decision was made when she noticed the rising water at the bottom of the embankment. The drainage ditch was overflowing, and within hours it could reach the car. Using her phone, she dialed 911, but as she feared, the call wouldn't connect. The storm had likely downed cell towers in the area. The landline at the house might work, but that would mean leaving the injured man alone while she went for help. "Sir, if you can hear me, I'm going to get you out of this car," Sarah explained, her emergency training guiding her actions. "I'm a registered nurse. I'll try not to cause additional injury." With considerable effort and careful maneuvering, Sarah managed to unlock the door from inside and force it open just enough to access the man properly. In the improved light from her flashlight, she could see he was in his mid to late 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested wealth and position, so out of place on their rural back road. The seriousness of his injuries became clearer as she checked him more thoroughly. Multiple lacerations, a possible concussion or worse from the head trauma, and concerning bruising across his chest from the seatbelt and airbag. His breathing was labored but stable for now. Sarah knew she couldn't safely move him alone, nor could she leave him to go for help. The flooding water made the decision even more urgent. She needed her father's assistance. After stabilizing the man's neck as best she could and covering him with her own raincoat to provide some protection from the elements, Sarah climbed back up to the road. The journey back to the farmhouse seemed interminable, the mud sucking at her boots and the rain obscuring her vision despite the flashlight. "Dad!" she called as she burst through the door, dripping water everywhere. "Dad, I need your help!" Robert Matthews appeared in the hallway, alarmed by his daughter's appearance and the urgency in her voice. "Sarah, what's happened?" "Car accident. On the access road," she explained breathlessly. "Driver's badly injured. We need to get him to the house. The ditch is flooding, and I can't get through to 911. To his credit, Robert asked no questions that could wait. Despite his arthritis and lingering injury, he moved with purpose, grabbing their first aid kit and following Sarah out into the storm. They took the old farm utility vehicle, which could navigate the muddy conditions better than attempting it. On foot again. Together, they managed to extract the unconscious man from the wreckage, using a door from their storage shed as a makeshift backboard to minimize movement to his spine. The journey back to the farmhouse was painstaking, with Sarah monitoring his vital signs continuously, while her father drove as carefully as the conditions allowed. By the time they reached the house, Sarah's medical assessment had grown even, more concerning. The man's skin was cool to the touch, his pulse thready, and the head wound continued to bleed despite the pressure she applied. "Get the guest room ready," she instructed her father as they carried the improvised stretcher into the house. "We need to warm him up and stop this bleeding." The guest room, unused since her mother's passing, was quickly prepared with layers of towels to protect the mattress. With practiced efficiency, Sarah began treating the stranger's injuries using their home medical supplies. a far more extensive kit than most households would have, given her profession and her mother's long illness. "Shouldn't we keep trying to get an ambulance?" Robert asked as he watched his daughter work. Sarah shook her head, her hands steady as she cleaned and bandaged the head wound. "Roads will be flooded between here and town. Even if we got through, they probably couldn't reach us for hours." She checked the man's pupils, frowning at the uneven response. "He has a serious concussion, possibly a skull fracture. Moving him further could be dangerous." Robert nodded, trusting his daughter's medical judgment. "What can I do?" "Call the hospital on the landline, see if you can get through. As for Dr. Winters, if possible, tell him I'm treating a trauma patient with suspected TBI and internal injuries. I need guidance until we can transport." As her father left to make the call, Sarah continued her assessment. The stranger's expensive. Clothing was soaked through, risking hypothermia. She would need to remove his wet garments and warm him gradually. As she carefully cut away his designer suit jacket, a wallet fell from the inner pocket. She shouldn't pry, she knew, but they needed to identify him, to know if he had medical conditions, allergies, and emergency contacts. Sarah opened the wallet, searching for identification. What she found made her blood run cold. The driver's license showed the face of the unconscious man before her, but it was the name that caused her hands to tremble. Alexander Reynolds, CEO, Reynolds Financial Group, the very man who owned the bank that was foreclosing on their farm. In just 7 days, Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at the man whose policies had pushed their interest rates beyond sustainable levels, whose company had denied their requests for extension despite their circumstantial hardships. The man who, according to the news, had come to their county specifically to review properties slated for foreclosure, likely including their farm. For one brief, dark moment, a terrible thought crossed her mind. No one knew he was here. If she provided less than optimal care, if she simply waited too long to get him help. Sarah shook her head sharply, banishing the thought immediately. Her oath as a nurse and her own moral compass would never allow such a thing, regardless of who he was or what he had done. She resumed her treatment with the same care she would show any patient, perhaps even more meticulously now that she understood. "The stakes, the lines are down," Robert reported as he returned to the room. "Storms knocked out communication to town. Cell towers, too, from what I could see on the emergency radio." Sarah nodded grimly. "Then it's just us until the storm passes." She gestured to the wallet on the bedside table. "Dad, you should know who we're helping. That's Alexander Reynolds." Her father's eyes widened in recognition. "Reynolds? From the bank?" "The very same," Sarah confirmed, applying a fresh bandage to the head wound. "The man foreclosing on our farm is now our patient." Robert stared at the unconscious figure for a long moment, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his weathered face. Then, with a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders. "What else do you need me to do?" he asked simply. In that moment, Sarah had never been prouder of her father. Despite everything they stood to lose because of this man's decisions, Robert Matthews would not compromise his humanity. "I need more light, fresh water, and every clean towel and sheet we have," Sarah instructed. "It's going to be a long night." As they worked together to stabilize Alexander Reynolds, the irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. Tomorrow, today now, according to the clock, she was supposed to attend a crucial job interview and the farmers' market, their last hopes for raising enough money to save their home from this very man's bank. Instead, she would be fighting to save his life, sacrificing what might be their final chance to save the farm in the process. The storm continued. The rage outside, but inside the farmhouse, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one that would change the course of all their lives before the sun rose again. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the guest room window as Sarah checked Alexander Reynolds' vital signs, for what felt like the 100th time. The storm had finally subsided, leaving behind an eerie silence, broken only by the steady drip of water from the gutters and the occasional groan from their patient. Sarah's eyes burned from exhaustion. She had maintained a bedside vigil throughout the night, monitoring Reynolds' condition and treating his injuries with their limited supplies. His head wound had finally stopped bleeding, but his breathing remained labored, and he had yet to regain consciousness, a concerning sign that reinforced her suspicion of serious brain trauma. Robert appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with coffee and toast. "You need to eat something," he insisted, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Can't help him if you collapse yourself." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, the warm mug soothing her chilled hands. "Thanks, Dad. Any luck with communications?" Robert shook his head. "Landlines are still down. I drove to the main road. Cell service is spotty at best. Left a message with the sheriff's office, but who knows when they'll get it. Roads to town are flooded in 3 places." He glanced at Reynolds. "How is he?" "Stable but not good," Sarah replied, medical training evident in her precise assessment. "Pupils still unequal, suggesting intracranial pressure. Breathing is shallow, but regular. He's showing intermittent signs of consciousness, moaning some movement, but hasn't fully awakened." Robert studied their unexpected guest with a complex expression. In the light of day, Reynolds looked younger than Sarah had initially thought, perhaps mid-30s. Despite his injuries, his features retained an aristocratic quality that seemed incongruous in their modest farmhouse. "I checked the car while I was out," Robert said after a moment. "Total loss. Found his phone, but it's damaged beyond repair. Also found this." He placed a leather briefcase on the floor. "Thought it might have information that could help. Medical history, emergency contacts." Sarah nodded, though she felt uncomfortable invading Reynolds' privacy further. Still, as his caretakers, they needed information that might aid his treatment. She opened the briefcase carefully, finding several folders labeled with property, addresses, including, she noted with a pang, their own farm. Beside these was a slim leather portfolio containing personal documents. "Medical alert card," she said with relief, extracting a small card from the portfolio. "No known allergies, no pre-existing conditions. Emergency contact is—" She paused, reading the name. "Elizabeth Reynolds' sister." A phone number followed. "I'll try calling when I get better reception," Robert offered. "Good idea." "She must be worried sick," Sarah agreed, despite the strange feeling of helping the man who represented their greatest threat. She returned to checking Reynolds' bandages, her touch gentle but clinical. Robert watched his daughter work with quiet pride. "You remind me so much of your mother right now," he said softly. Sarah glanced up, surprised by the comparison. "Mom?" She had that same look when tending to anyone who was hurting, total focus, absolute compassion, regardless of who they were. Robert's voice held the familiar mixture of love and grief that emerged whenever he spoke of his late wife. "Remember that summer when Tyler Jenkins crashed his tractor into our fence? Your mother treated his cuts while I waited for the sheriff, even though he'd been nothing but trouble for us for years." Sarah smiled at the memory. Tyler Jenkins had disputed their property line for a decade, making baseless claims about water rights and access roads. Yet when he'd been injured on their land, Emma Matthews had acted without hesitation, treating his wounds with the same care she would show a beloved friend. She always said, "How we treat people when they're vulnerable shows who we really are." Sarah quoted softly, "Exactly." Robert nodded toward Reynolds. "I know what he represents, what his bank is doing to us and families like ours. But right now, he's just a man who needs help. Your mother would be proud of what you did last night." Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. The weight of their situation, the impending foreclosure, the missed interview, the farmer's market they would now miss, pressed against her chest. Yet somehow her father's reminder of her mother's values provided a strange clarity. "I should be at that interview right now," she said, checking her watch, "and we should be setting up our stall at the market." "Some things matter more," Robert replied simply. A low moan from the bed drew their attention. Reynolds stirred, his eyelids fluttering but not opening fully. Sarah immediately shifted into nurse mode, checking his responses and vital signs. "Mr. Reynolds, can you hear me?" she asked clearly, using the penlight from their first aid kit to check his pupillary response. "You've been in an accident. You're safe. I'm a nurse, and we're taking care of you." Reynolds mumbled something unintelligible, then lapsed back into unconsciousness. Still, the brief response was encouraging. His brain function was active, even if he wasn't fully awake. "That's a good sign," Sarah told her father. "But he needs a hospital as soon as possible. The longer he goes without proper neurological assessment, the greater the risk of permanent damage." Robert nodded grimly. "I'll try the roads again in an hour, see if the water's receded anywhere." As her father left to check on their crops after the storm, Sarah continued her examination of Reynolds. His expensive suit had been ruined. She'd had to cut it away to check for additional injuries. Now he wore one of her father's old T-shirts and sweatpants, lending him a strangely vulnerable appearance, completely at odds with the corporate titan who had signed their foreclosure notice. Sarah found herself wondering about the man behind the signature. What kind of person was Alexander Reynolds when he wasn't foreclosing on family farms? Did he have family beyond the sister listed as his emergency contact? What had brought him to their remote road in the middle of a storm? As if in response to her thoughts, Reynolds stirred again, this time with more purpose. His eyelids fluttered, then opened partially. His gaze was unfocused at first, then slowly centered on Sarah's face. "Where?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're at Willow Creek Farm," Sarah explained calmly, falling into the reassuring tone she used with disoriented patience. "You had an accident during the storm last night. Your car went off the road. I'm Sarah Matthews. I'm a registered nurse. My father and I brought you here to treat your injuries." Reynolds frowned slightly, wincing at the movement. "Hospital?" "We couldn't reach emergency services because of the storm. The roads are flooded and communications are down." Sarah checked his pulse as she spoke, noting it was stronger than before. "You have a serious concussion, possibly a fracture, along with some lacerations and bruising. I've been monitoring you through the night." He seemed to process this information slowly, his eyes struggling to focus. "Thank you," he managed before fatigue overtook him again, his eyes drifting closed. "Rest now," Sarah said softly, adjusting his bandage. "We'll get you to a hospital as soon as the road's clear." Throughout the morning, Reynolds drifted in and out of consciousness, each period of wakefulness slightly longer than the last. Sarah maintained her careful monitoring, documenting his responses and vital signs in a makeshift chart. Her training told her his condition was improving, but he still needed proper medical care beyond what she could provide. Around noon, Robert returned from checking the roads. "Good news and bad news," he reported. "North Road is clearing, might be passable by late afternoon, but I ran into Sheriff Davis. The hospital's operating on emergency generators, and they're overwhelmed with storm injuries. He says they're diverting all but the most critical cases." Sarah frowned. "Reynolds needs a CT scan and neurological workup. He can't wait days for proper treatment." Sheriff said the hospital in Greenfield is fully operational. They didn't get hit as hard by the storm. "But that's an hour away on good roads," Sarah finished. She glanced at Reynolds, who had fallen into what appeared to be natural sleep, rather than unconsciousness. "If the North Road clears by evening, we could attempt it. I'll prep the truck," Robert decided. "Check the spare tire, make sure we have enough gas." Sarah nodded gratefully. Despite everything this man represented, her father hadn't questioned the decision to continue helping him. She wondered briefly if Reynolds would show the same compassion if their situations were reversed. As the afternoon progressed, the sun emerged fully, beginning the process of drying the saturated landscape. Sarah divided her time between checking on their patient and salvaging what she could from their storm-damaged crops. The tomato plants had taken the worst beating, many now flattened beyond recovery. The lost income would make their financial situation even more desperate. Around 3 o'clock, Sarah returned to the house to find Reynolds awake and more alert than before. He was attempting to sit up when she entered the room. "You shouldn't be moving," she admonished gently, hurrying to his side. "You could exacerbate your injuries." Reynolds sank back against the pillows, looking pale from the effort. "I need phone," he managed, his speech slightly slurred but comprehensible. "People waiting." "Your phone was destroyed in the accident," Sarah explained, checking his bandages. "We're trying to contact your emergency contact, Elizabeth, but communications are still limited." A flash of concern crossed his face. "Sister, we'll worry. We'll reach her as soon as possible," Sarah promised. "In the meantime, you need to rest. We're hoping to transport you to Greenfield Memorial this evening if the road's clear." Reynolds studied her face, his gaze more focused than it had been previously. "You're a nurse?" "Yes, I work at County General in Riverside, but—" She hesitated, then decided simple truth was best. "I'm also a farmer. This is my family's farm." Something flickered across his face. Confusion, perhaps, as if trying to place why that might be significant, but his injuries clearly prevented him from making the connection. "Lucky for me," he said with effort. "Could have died out there." "Anyone would have helped," Sarah replied, though she wondered if that was truly the case. "No." Reynolds shook his head slightly, immediately grimacing at the pain the movement caused. "Most people walk past, not get involved." The simple observation caught Sarah off guard. It sounded like the voice of experience, not the cynical view she would have expected from someone in his position. "Well, that's not how we do things here," she said, adjusting his pillows to make him more comfortable. "Can you tell me what you remember about the accident?" Reynolds closed his eyes, concentration evident on his face. "Rain. Couldn't see. GPS. Took me on back roads, then lights, bright lights, swerved." He opened his eyes, frustration clear. "That's all?" "That's okay," Sarah assured him. "Memory gaps are normal with concussions. It may come back in time." Robert appeared in the doorway. "Sarah, need you for a minute." She excused herself, joining her father in the hallway. "What is it?" "Just got through to the sheriff again. Hospital in Greenfield says they can take him, but we need to get there before 8. After that, their neurology department will be reduced to emergency staff only." Sarah glanced at her watch. "Already past 4. We should leave as soon as possible. The North Road." "Passable now, according to Davis. I've got the truck ready." Sarah nodded decisively. "Let's prepare him for transport. We'll need to stabilize his neck and keep him as still as possible during the drive." As they gathered supplies and prepared to move Reynolds, Sarah reflected on the strange turn of events that had made them responsible for the very man threatening their livelihood. Her mother would have seen it as more than coincidence. Emma Matthews had always believed that challenges appeared precisely when needed, testing character and opening unexpected doors. "Everything happens for a reason," she would say. "Our job is to respond with grace and see where the path leads." Looking at Reynolds, injured, vulnerable, completely dependent on their care, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what reason could possibly lie behind this particular convergence of circumstances. One thing was certain: the path forward was anything but clear. What she did know with absolute certainty was that her mother's values would continue to guide her actions, regardless of the cost to herself. Emma Matthews had lived by a simple principle: do right by others and trust the rest will follow. It had carried her through cancer treatments with dignity, had informed her final days with grace, and now it would guide her daughter through this most unexpected challenge. As Sarah carefully prepared Reynolds for the journey to Greenfield Memorial, she silently hoped her mother's wisdom would prove true once again. "Easy now," Sarah instructed as she and her father carefully transferred Alexander Reynolds from the bed to the makeshift stretcher they'd created. "We need to keep his head and neck stable during the entire journey." Reynolds was conscious, but groggy, his eyes focusing and unfocusing as they secured him for transport. "Where going?" he asked, wincing as they lifted him. "Greenfield Memorial Hospital," Sarah explained, her voice calm and reassuring despite the strain of the situation. "It's about an hour away, but they have the neurological equipment you need. Just try to remain still during the trip." The journey to their old farm truck was painstaking, with Sarah monitoring Reynolds' condition with each step. Robert had converted the truck bed into a protected transport space, using tarps to create a shelter against the elements and padding the floor with their spare mattress and blankets. "It's not an ambulance," Robert said apologetically as they secured Reynolds in the truck bed, "but it'll get us there." Sarah climbed in beside their patient, carrying a first aid kit and emergency supplies. "I'll ride back here to monitor him." "You okay to drive the whole way, Dad?" Robert nodded, though the lines of pain around his eyes betrayed the toll his arthritis was taking. "I've driven through worse than some flooded roads." As Robert started the engine, Sarah checked her watch. Just past 5 p.m. If the roads were passable, they should reach Greenfield Memorial by 6:30, well before the neurology department reduced to emergency staffing at 8. But that was a significant if. The storm had been devastating, and rural roads were often the last to receive attention during recovery efforts. The truck lurched forward, beginning the slow journey down their long driveway. Every bump and jostle caused Reynolds to grimace, though he remained remarkably stoic for someone with his injuries. "Try to relax," Sarah advised him, checking his vital signs again. "I'll be right here the whole time." As they reached the main road, Sarah's phone suddenly chimed, the first signal it had received since the storm began. A flood of delayed notifications appeared on her screen, including 3 increasingly concerned messages from Greenfield Memorial Hospital regarding her missed interview. The final message, received just an hour ago, cut through her like a physical pain. "As you failed to appear for your scheduled interview and did not contact us to reschedule, we have offered the position to another candidate. We wish you success in your future endeavors." Sarah stared at the message, a hollow feeling spreading through her chest. The position, the one that would have paid enough to save the farm, was gone. Between caring for Reynolds and the aftermath of the storm, she had missed her opportunity. One more hope extinguished. Her phone chimed again, this time with a notification from the farmer's market coordinator. "Market closed early due to storm damage. Rescheduled for next weekend." Another lost chance to earn money toward their mortgage payment. The deadline was now just 6 days away. Reynolds stirred beside her, his eyes focusing on her face with surprising clarity. "Bad news?" he asked, his voice stronger than it had been earlier. Sarah quickly tucked her phone away, professional demeanor sliding back into place. "Nothing important. How are you feeling?" "Like I drove off a road in a storm," he replied with unexpected dry humor. "Which, apparently, I did." His improved lucidity was a good sign, Sarah noted professionally, though his pupils remained uneven, indicating the brain injury still required urgent attention. "Do you remember anything more about what happened?" she asked, partly to keep him engaged and alert, partly out of genuine curiosity. Reynolds frowned slightly, concentration evident. "I was heading to Riverside, meeting tomorrow morning." His frown deepened. "Important meeting. Property assessments. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. Property assessments, likely including their farm. The foreclosure wasn't just a corporate decision. Reynolds himself was directly involved. GPS recalculating, he continued, piecing together fragmented memories. Storm getting worse, then headlights coming straight at me. His eyes widened slightly. Logging truck, on my side of the road. I swerved and... That explains it, Sarah said. There was a logging operation up north. Their trucks sometimes take the access road as a shortcut, even though they're not supposed to. The truck hit a particularly deep pothole, jolting them all. Reynolds gasped in pain, his hand instinctively reaching for Sarah's. She allowed the contact, recognizing it as a natural human response to distress rather than any personal connection. Sorry. About that, Robert called from the cab. Roads are a mess. We're okay, Sarah replied, though Reynolds' grip on her hand suggested otherwise. To distract him from the pain, she continued their conversation. So you were coming to Riverside for business? Reynolds nodded slightly, careful not to move his head too much. Reynolds Financial acquired several local banks last year. First Regional was one of them. He paused, his breath catching as the truck navigated another rough patch. Need to review properties before final decisions. Final decisions about foreclosures, you mean? Sarah said before she could stop herself, an edge creeping into her voice despite her best intentions. Something flickered across Reynolds' face. Confusion, then the beginning of recognition. You're Matthews, Willow Creek Farm. His eyes searched her face. You're on my list. Sarah met his gaze steadily, professional duty warring with personal anguish. Yes, Mr. Reynolds. The farm you're foreclosing on in 6 days is the same, one where you've been receiving medical care for the past 12 hours. The irony of the situation seemed to hit Reynolds fully. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a new awareness. I didn't know, he said quietly. Why would you? Sarah replied, her tone softening despite herself. We're just one of many properties to you, numbers on a spreadsheet. Reynolds started to shake his head, but stopped at the pain the movement caused. It's not that simple. Before Sarah could respond, the truck slowed abruptly. Through the back window, she could see flashing lights ahead, emergency vehicles blocking the road. Robert rolled down his window as a sheriff's deputy approached. Roads washed out about half a mile ahead, the officer explained. Going to be closed for at least 24 hours. You folks need to turn around. We have an injured man, Robert responded urgently. Head trauma. We're trying to get him to Greenfield Memorial. The deputy peered into the truck bed, taking in the makeshift medical transport and Sarah's obvious caretaking role. You a medical professional, ma'am? Registered nurse, county general, Sarah confirmed. He needs neurological assessment as soon as possible. The deputy considered this, then pointed west. County Road 8 is still open. It'll add about 40 minutes to your journey, but it's your best option right now. Follow the detour signs once. You reach the junction. Robert thanked the officer and carefully turned the truck around. We're looking at nearly 2 hours now, he told Sarah through the back window. Might not make it before their neurology department reduces staff. Sarah checked her watch anxiously. Already 5:30 p.m. Even with no further delays, they wouldn't reach Greenfield Memorial until well after 7 p.m. We'll call ahead, she decided. Explain the situation. Using her phone's spotty reception, Sarah managed to reach the hospital and explain their emergency. The response was not encouraging. The neurologist would try to wait, but with storm victims arriving from throughout the region, they couldn't guarantee availability beyond their stated hours. As she ended the call, Sarah noticed Reynolds watching her, his expression pained but alert. You're going to extraordinary lengths, he observed quietly. Given who I am, to your family, Sarah checked his vital signs again before responding. "You're my patient, Mr. Reynolds. That supersedes everything else. Even though I represent the bank taking your home?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Even though." A complicated emotion crossed Reynolds's face. Something like respect, perhaps, or puzzlement. Most people wouldn't be so ethical. "I'm not most people," Sarah replied simply. Then, unable to contain the question burning inside her, "Why? Did you double our interest rates? We had a payment plan with First Regional before your company took over." Reynolds closed his eyes briefly, fatigue evident in every line of his face. Corporate restructuring, regional banks, underperforming, new policies implemented across all acquired properties. New policies that pushed dozens of family farms into foreclosure, Sarah said, trying and failing to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Including ours. Business decisions," Reynolds murmured, though something in his tone suggested discomfort. "Not personal. It feels pretty personal when it's your family's home of 3 generations, Sarah countered. She glanced at her father. Through the back window, his shoulders hunched as he navigated the unfamiliar detour route. "My father has worked that land his entire life. My mother is buried there." Reynolds remained silent, whether from fatigue or having no response. Sarah couldn't tell. The truck rumbled on, each mile taking them further from their original route and cutting into the precious time window for specialized medical care. After nearly 20 minutes of tense silence, broken only by Sarah's regular medical checks, Reynolds spoke again. "The interview you missed, because of me." Sarah looked up, surprised he had made the connection. "You heard that?" "Enough," he admitted. "Important job." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "At Greenfield Memorial, ironically enough. Double my current salary. Would have made a difference for the farm." "I'm sorry," Reynolds said, the simple words carrying unexpected weight. "It's not your fault you crashed during a storm," Sarah replied, professional training overriding personal disappointment. "Still," Reynolds insisted, "you chose to help me, at significant cost." Sarah adjusted his blanket, deflecting the observation. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Reynolds said with surprising firmness. "They wouldn't. I've seen enough of humanity to know extraordinary kindness when I encounter it." Before Sarah could respond, the truck lurched to a sudden stop. Through the back window, she could see another roadblock ahead, this time a massive fallen tree blocking their path completely. Robert climbed out to speak with the emergency workers, returning moments later with a grim expression. "No way through," he reported. "Tree took down power lines with it. Crew says it'll be at least 5 hours before they can clear it safely." Sarah's heart sank. "What about alternatives? Only other route would take us nearly 3 hours. We'd never make it in time." She looked at Reynolds, whose condition, while improved, still required specialized care they couldn't provide. The decision crystallized in her mind. Difficult, potentially costly, but the only ethical choice. "We need to go back to Riverside," she said firmly. "County General might not have a neurologist on staff tonight, but their emergency care is solid. It's our best option now." "But that's nearly an hour back the way we came," Robert protested, "and roads in that direction were even worse." "We don't have a choice, Dad," Sarah insisted. "He needs medical care and Riverside is our only viable option now." The implication hung unspoken between them. Returning to Riverside meant driving directly away from Greenfield and any chance of speaking with the hospital administration about the lost job opportunity. It meant committing to another night of caring for Reynolds, further depleting their limited resources and energy when they should be focusing on saving their farm. Robert studied his daughter's face, then nodded slowly. "You're right. Riverside it is." As they carefully turned around once more, Reynolds reached for Sarah's hand again. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. You've already done more than enough." "Yes, I do," Sarah replied with quiet certainty. "Because this is who we are. This is what matters." In that moment, with the weight of their impending foreclosure pressing down and their last financial hope slipping away, Sarah made her choice. She chose the values her mother had instilled in her: compassion over convenience, ethics over expediency, humanity over self-interest. As the truck began its slow journey toward Riverside County General, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace beneath her worry and exhaustion. Her mother had always said that right actions brought their own rewards, even when those rewards weren't immediately visible. Looking at Alexander Reynolds, the man whose company was taking their home, now completely dependent on their care and goodwill, Sarah wondered what unexpected consequences this selfless decision might ultimately bring. The fluorescent lights of Riverside County General's emergency department cast harsh shadows across the waiting room, where Sarah and Robert Matthews had spent the last 3 hours. It was nearly midnight, and exhaustion hung heavy on both their shoulders. Sarah glanced at her father, noticing how he massaged his arthritic knee, a silent testament to the strain of the day. "You should go home, Dad," she suggested gently. "Get some rest. I can stay and wait for news." Robert shook his head stubbornly. "We came together. We'll leave together." The emergency department had been chaotic when they arrived, overflowing with injuries from the storm. Despite Sarah's professional connections, Alexander Reynolds had still waited nearly an hour before being rushed for a CT scan and neurological assessment. Since then, updates had been sparse as the overwhelmed medical staff attended to multiple emergencies. Sarah's colleague, Nurse Jenkins, appeared from behind the security doors, her scrubs spattered with what looked like blood, and her face etched with the weariness that came from an extended disaster response shift. "Any news?" Sarah asked, rising to meet her. "Your VIP is stable," Jenkins reported. CT showed a moderate concussion, but no skull fracture or bleeding, which is frankly miraculous given what you described. Dr. Patel wants to keep him overnight for observation, but the prognosis is good. Relief washed over Sarah. Despite the complicated emotions Reynolds evoked as their bank's foreclosure agent, she had genuinely worried about his condition. "Can we see him?" Jenkins nodded. "He's been asking for you, actually. Quite insistent. They've moved him to a private room. On the 3rd floor, 303. I can take you up." Sarah glanced at her father. "Dad?" "You go," Robert said, waving her away. "I'll wait here. These chairs aren't getting any more comfortable, but they'll do." Despite her father's assurance, Sarah knew the hard plastic chairs would only worsen his condition. "At least take the truck and head home. I can get a ride with someone from the hospital later. And leave you stranded? Not a chance." Robert's tone brooked no argument, the same stubborn determination that had kept their farm going through drought, market crashes, and personal tragedy. Recognizing a losing battle, Sarah followed Jenkins to the elevator. As they rode to the 3rd floor, her colleague gave her a curious look. "So, want to tell me why you're personally caring for the CEO of Reynolds Financial? Isn't that the bank that's foreclosing on our farm?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed, too tired to dissemble. "Ironic, isn't it?" Jenkins let out a low whistle. "Life has a twisted sense of humor sometimes. Though I have to say, from the way he was asking about you, I don't think he sees you as just the farmer he's foreclosing on." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" He seemed impressed. "Kept asking if you were still here, wanting to make sure. You knew he was going to be okay." Jenkins shrugged. "Just an observation." They arrived at room 303, where Jenkins left Sarah with a supportive squeeze of her arm. "Good luck. Whatever happens with the farm, you're always welcome on my couch. If you need a place to crash." The offer, well-intentioned as it was, drove home the reality of their situation. In less than a week, they might truly be homeless. Sarah took a deep breath before entering Reynolds' room. Inside, the banking executive looked markedly improved from their journey. The hospital had cleaned and properly dressed his wounds, and IV fluids had restored some color to his face. He was propped up slightly on pillows, his expression alert despite the late hour. "Ms. Matthews," he greeted her, his voice stronger than it had been during their bumpy journey. "I was beginning to think you'd left. We wanted to make sure you were properly settled," Sarah replied professionally, automatically checking the monitors beside his bed. A nurse's instinct. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck, or rather, like I nearly hit a truck. And then a tree." He attempted a smile that turned into a wince. "But significantly better than I would be if you hadn't found me." Sarah acknowledged this with a nod. "The doctor says you were lucky. No skull fracture, no internal bleeding." "So I'm told, thanks to your immediate care." Reynolds studied her face for a moment. "You look exhausted. You should go home, get some rest. My father's waiting downstairs. We'll head back soon." An awkward silence fell between them, the bizarre intimacy of their shared ordeal colliding with the reality of their adversarial positions. Reynolds was the first to break it. "I've been thinking about what you said, about your farm being in your family for generations." Sarah tensed, unsure where this was leading. 3 generations. My grandfather cleared the land himself in the 1940s after returning from war. Reynolds nodded slowly, mindful of his head injury. "And the foreclosure is set for 6 days from now," Sarah replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. "Though I suppose you already know that, since you were coming to evaluate the property." "Among others, yes." Reynolds shifted slightly, adjusting his position. With a grimace. "Ms. Matthews, Sarah, if I may, I'd like to understand your situation better. The file says your loan was restructured 6 months ago, but payments stopped 3 months later." Sarah's professional demeanor wavered. This man had been her patient, dependent on her care, and now he was discussing their foreclosure as if it were just another business matter. "My mother's medical bills," she said stiffly. "Cancer treatment. Insurance covered only a portion." Something flickered across Reynolds' face. Recognition, perhaps even empathy. "I'm sorry for your loss. We managed to make partial payments, but after Reynolds Financial acquired First Regional, our interest rate doubled overnight. The payment plan we'd arranged was invalidated." Reynolds frowned. "That shouldn't have happened. Our acquisition protocols include honoring existing payment arrangements." "Well, it did happen," Sarah countered. "We received a letter stating that all loans were being evaluated under the new corporate guidelines. Our monthly payment increased by 80%. Reynolds was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then with visible effort he reached for the call button beside his bed. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, surprised. "Getting my phone and briefcase. I need to make some calls." A nurse appeared in response to the call. Reynolds requested his personal effects with an authority that seemed incongruous with his hospital-gowned state, but effective nonetheless. Minutes later, an orderly delivered his salvaged briefcase and a hospital phone since his cell had been destroyed in the crash. "It's midnight," Sarah pointed out. "Whoever you're calling is likely asleep." Reynolds offered a thin smile. "One advantage of being CEO, people answer my calls, regardless of the hour." He opened his briefcase, wincing slightly at the movement, and extracted a business card. "Could you dial this number for me? My coordination isn't quite back to normal." Reluctantly, Sarah dialed the number. Reynolds took the phone, and to her surprise, someone answered almost immediately. "Marcus, it's Alex Reynolds," he began without preamble. "Yes, I'm aware of the time. I've had an accident. I'm fine," he added quickly. "But I'm at Riverside County General. I need you to do something for me immediately." Sarah watched with increasing curiosity as Reynolds issued a series of precise instructions, mentioning file numbers and protocols that meant nothing to her. After several minutes, he handed her the phone. "He needs to speak with you," Reynolds explained. Bewildered, Sarah took the phone. "This is Sarah Matthews. Ms. Matthews, I'm Marcus Whitfield, Chief of Operations at Reynolds Financial." A crisp voice informed her. "Mr. Reynolds has instructed me to place an immediate hold on your foreclosure proceedings pending review. I need to verify your property details." Sarah provided the information in a daze, struggling to process this unexpected development. When the call ended, she turned to Reynolds with obvious confusion. "What just happened?" "I've suspended your foreclosure for 30 days while we investigate the interest rate issue," Reynolds explained. "If what you're saying is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt it is, then someone in the transition team made a serious error." Hope and suspicion warred within Sarah. "Why would you do this? After all, we're just one farm among many in your portfolio." Reynolds held her gaze steadily. "Let's just say I believe in correcting mistakes, including my own. Your farm should never have had its payment plan invalidated." "And if we still can't make the payments after 30 days?" Sarah asked, unwilling to embrace false hope. "One step at a time, Ms. Matthews." Reynolds leaned back against his pillows, fatigue evident in his features. "For now, you have some breathing room. My team will contact you tomorrow to review your case in detail." Sarah stood speechless, the implications slowly sinking in. 30 days. Not a solution, but time. Precious time they hadn't had hours ago. A soft knock at the door preceded a nurse entering with medication. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Reynolds needs his pain medication and rest." Sarah nodded, gathering herself. "Of course, I should go check on my father anyway." As she turned to leave, Reynolds called after her. "Sarah, thank you for everything." The simple words carried a weight that transcended their professional encounters. Patient and nurse, banker and farmer. For a moment, they were simply two humans, acknowledging a connection forged through crisis. Sarah made her way back to the waiting room, her mind spinning with this unexpected turn of events. She found her father dozing uncomfortably in a chair, his weathered face etched with exhaustion. "Dad," she said softly, touching his shoulder. "Dad, wake up." Robert startled awake, disorientation quickly replaced by concern. "Sarah, is everything all right? How's Reynolds?" "He's going to be fine," she assured him. "But something else has happened. He's suspended our foreclosure for 30 days, pending review." Robert stared at her, incomprehension giving way to cautious hope. "He what? Why would he do that?" "He says there was an error when Reynolds Financial took over First Regional, that our payment plan should never have been invalidated." Sarah sank into the chair beside her father. "I don't know if it will change anything in the long run, but we have 30 days to figure something out." Robert rubbed his face, processing this information. 30 days, he repeated, as if tasting the words. That's something at least." They sat in silence for a moment, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the emergency department gradually quieting as the night deepened. 30 days wouldn't save the farm, but it provided a window, a chance to explore options they'd thought closed to them just hours ago. "Let's go home," Sarah finally said, helping her father to his feet. "We both need sleep." As they made their slow way to the parking lot, the night air felt different somehow, still heavy with humidity from the storm, but with a subtle shift, as if the atmospheric pressure had changed. The moon had emerged from behind the dissipating clouds, casting silver light across the rain-washed landscape. Neither spoke during the drive home, both too exhausted and overwhelmed to process fully what had transpired. The flooded roads had begun to recede, though they still navigated carefully around downed branches and debris from the storm. As they approached Willow Creek Farm, Sarah felt a surge of emotion seeing their home silhouetted against the night sky. This morning she had awakened believing they had less than a week left in this place. Now, though nothing was certain, they had been granted the most precious commodity of all: time. Robert pulled the truck to a stop before the farmhouse, turning off the engine but making no move to exit. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "your mother always used to say that kindness returns to you in unexpected ways." Sarah smiled faintly, remembering. "She did. When you insisted on helping Reynolds, even after we knew who he was, even after missing your interview, I thought she would have been proud, but I never imagined that it would actually change anything," Sarah finished. "Me neither." As they climbed wearily from the truck, a shooting star traced a brilliant path across the clearing sky. Sarah's mother had considered such moments signs. Cosmic winks, she'd called them. Inside, the farmhouse felt different too. The space where they had treated Reynolds still bore evidence of their emergency care. Discarded bandage wrappers, towels stained with rain and blood, the guest bed stripped to its mattress. Yet instead of reminding Sarah of what they had sacrificed, these remnants now represented an unexpected turning point. She checked her phone before collapsing into bed, finding a text message from an unknown number. "Ms. Matthews, Marcus Whitfield. To hear. Meeting arranged for 2 p.m. tomorrow at your property to discuss loan restructuring. Mr. Reynolds insists this be prioritized. Please confirm availability." Sarah stared at the message, reality slowly penetrating her exhaustion. This wasn't just a temporary stay of execution. Reynolds was actively intervening in their case. The implications were too enormous to contemplate with her current level of fatigue. She sent a quick confirmation, then set her phone aside. Within moments, sleep claimed her, bringing with it dreams not of loss and displacement, but of possibility, the first such dreams she had experienced in months. Outside her window, the storm-cleansed world continued its quiet recovery, paralleling the unexpected hope that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. Sarah awoke just after dawn, her body protesting the previous day's exertions, but her mind surprisingly alert. For a moment she lay still, allowing the events of the past 36 hours to settle into coherence. The storm, finding Reynolds in the wreckage, the missed interview, and finally the unexpected reprieve from foreclosure. She reached for her phone, half expecting the text from Marcus Whitfield to have vanished, a dream born of desperation. But there it was, concrete and real. A meeting at 2 p.m. to discuss restructuring their loan. Pulling on work clothes, Sarah made her way to the kitchen, where she found her father already awake and making coffee. The familiar domesticity of the scene struck her anew. Her father standing in the same spot where he had prepared morning coffee for decades, the worn countertops that had supported 3 generations of family meals, the window that framed the eastern fields perfectly to catch the sunrise. "Morning," Robert greeted her, sliding a steaming mug across the counter. "Sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Sarah admitted. "You?" "Like a rock." He gestured toward his phone on the table. "Got a text from someone named Whitfield confirming a meeting today. Thought I might have dreamed that part." Sarah smiled faintly. "Not a dream, though I'm still not sure what to make of it." They took their coffee to the porch, a morning ritual. Whenever weather permitted, the farm spread before them, glistening with dew in the early light. Storm damage was evident, flattened sections of crops, a fence down near the western border, branches scattered across the yard. But the core of Willow Creek Farm had withstood nature's fury, as it had for generations. "We should clean up before they arrive," Robert said, surveying the debris. "Make the place presentable." Sarah nodded, though she wondered how much difference appearances would make to banking executives. They would see the numbers, not the home. They spent the morning in steady labor, clearing branches, salvaging what crops they could, repairing the damaged fence. By noon, they had made significant progress, though Sarah couldn't help calculating the lost revenue from their damaged tomato plants. Even with the foreclosure delayed, their financial situation remained precarious. At 12:30, Sarah went inside to shower and change. She deliberated over her clothing, finally selecting a simple blue dress that had been her mother's favorite. Professional enough to convey seriousness, but not so formal as to appear desperate or detached from the reality of farm life. Her mother would have approved. Robert, too, had traded his work clothes for clean jeans and a button-down shirt, his version of formal attire. They prepared a simple lunch, neither particularly hungry, but recognizing the need for sustenance before what promised to be a challenging meeting. "What do you think will happen?" Robert asked as they ate. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Best case, they acknowledge the error in raising our interest rates and restore the original payment plan. That would give us breathing room, especially if I can find another position to replace the greenfield opportunity. And worst case, this is all procedural, a formality before they proceed with foreclosure anyway." Sarah met her father's eyes frankly. "Reynolds might feel personally indebted because we helped him, but corporations don't operate on gratitude. We need to be prepared for that possibility." Robert nodded, his expression resolute. "Whatever happens, we face it together. Just like always." At precisely 1:45 p.m., the sound of approaching vehicles drew them to the front window. 3 cars were making their way up the long driveway, 2 black sedans, and, to Sarah's surprise, an ambulance. "What in the world?" Robert murmured as they stepped onto the porch, the vehicles parked in the circular drive before the farmhouse. From the first sedan emerged a tall, distinguished black man in his 50s, carrying a leather portfolio. Marcus Whitfield, Sarah presumed. From the second car, a woman in her 30s exited, her tailored suit and precise movements marking her as another corporate representative. But it was the ambulance that commanded Sarah's attention as its rear doors opened to reveal Alexander Reynolds on a gurney, being assisted into a wheelchair by a medical attendant. "Mr. Reynolds," Sarah called, hurrying down the porch steps. "What are you doing here? You should be in the hospital." Reynolds, looking pale but determined, offered a smile that seemed to cost him some effort. "Ms. Matthews, thank you for accommodating this meeting on such short notice." "The doctor released you already?" Sarah asked, skeptically, her nurse's assessment noting his obvious fatigue and discomfort. "Not exactly," Reynolds admitted. "Let's say I've been granted a temporary medical parole for important business. I'll return to the hospital afterward for observation." Sarah's professional disapproval must have shown on her face, because Reynolds added, "Don't worry, I have medical supervision." He nodded toward the attendant. "And some matters are too important to handle remotely." Marcus Whitfield stepped forward, extending his hand first to Sarah, then to Robert. "Mr. and Miss Matthews, I'm Marcus Whitfield, Chief Operations Officer at Reynolds Financial. This is Jessica Chen, our Regional Loan Restructuring Specialist." The woman nodded in greeting, her expression professionally neutral. "Shall we go inside?" Robert suggested, gesturing toward the house. "We can sit in the living room." As they made their way into the farmhouse, Sarah couldn't help noticing Reynolds taking in their home, the well-worn furniture, the family photographs. On the walls, the simple but tasteful decor that reflected generations of care and modest means. His expression revealed nothing of his thoughts, but Sarah sensed he was absorbing details, forming impressions. Once they were settled, Reynolds in his wheelchair positioned near the couch where Whitfield and Chen sat, Robert in his favorite armchair, and Sarah perched on its arm. Whitfield opened his portfolio. "Before we begin," Reynolds said, surprising everyone, "I'd like to see the farm." 4 pairs of eyes turned to him in various states of confusion. Alex, we have all the property. Assessments, Whitfield began. Assessments don't tell the whole story, Reynolds interrupted. Ms. Matthews, would you mind showing me your operation? I understand if you're not comfortable with that request. Sarah exchanged a glance with her father, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Of course, she agreed, though I'm not sure how much ground we can cover with your wheelchair. We can drive, Reynolds suggested. Your father and my colleagues can begin reviewing the financial documentation while we take a brief tour. The arrangement was unusual, but Sarah saw no reason to refuse. Minutes later, she found herself driving the farm utility vehicle with Reynolds secured in the passenger seat, his medical attendant following discreetly in the ambulance. Where would you like to start? Sarah asked as they pulled away from the house. Show me what matters most to you, Reynolds replied. What makes Willow Creek Farm special? Sarah considered this, then steered them toward the eastern fields. Our heirloom vegetables, she explained as they drove. My mother started this program 15 years ago, growing varieties you can't find in supermarkets. They're more labor-intensive, but fetch premium prices at farmers' markets and with local restaurants. Reynolds observed the neat rows, nodding appreciatively. Organic. Certified. It took 3 years to complete the transition, but it's been worth it. Pride crept into Sarah's voice despite her wariness. We've built a reputation for quality that's kept us going through some tough times. They continued to the orchards, where Reynolds asked thoughtful questions about varieties and yields. Sarah found herself responding with increasing animation, her passion for the farm overriding her caution. My grandfather planted these trees, she explained as they paused beneath a particularly magnificent apple tree. He believed in planning for futures he might never see. Good farmers plant for their grandchildren, he always said. Reynolds reached out, touching the rough bark thoughtfully. My grandfather was a farmer, he said unexpectedly. Small place in Virginia. Nothing like this scale, but similar values. Sarah looked at him in surprise. You never mentioned that. A shadow passed across Reynolds' face. Lost it during the farm crisis in the 80s. Bank foreclosure. I was 12. The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with implications. Sarah studied Reynolds. With new eyes, seeing beyond the corporate executive to the child who had experienced the very devastation now threatening her family. What happened to him? Your grandfather, she asked quietly. Moved in with us, took a job as a night watchman at a warehouse, never farmed again. Reynolds met her gaze directly. He died believing he had failed, that losing the farm meant he had failed his family legacy. Sarah felt an unexpected empathy for this man who had seemed so removed from their reality. I'm sorry. I went into banking because I thought I understood something fundamental about the relationship between financial institutions and the people they serve, Reynolds continued, his voice taking on a reflective quality. Somewhere along the way, I think I lost sight of that understanding. They sat in silence for a moment, the gentle rustling of leaves filling the space between them. Finally, Reynolds spoke again. Your mother died of cancer, I understand. Sarah nodded, surprised by the personal turn in conversation. 2 years ago, pancreatic. She fought it for 18 months. My wife, Reynolds said softly. Ovarian cancer, 3 years ago. Their eyes met, a moment of profound recognition passing between them, the unmistakable bond of those who have watched loved ones battle an implacable enemy. Is that why you're doing this? Sarah asked directly. Because we have that in common? Reynolds considered the question. Not entirely, though I won't pretend it doesn't affect me. When you care for someone through that journey, it changes your perspective. It does, Sarah agreed. Makes some things seem more important, others less. So, exactly. Reynolds gestured toward the farmhouse visible in the distance. When I was in your home, unconscious, vulnerable, you didn't see the CEO of Reynolds Financial. You saw a human being in need. You made choices based on that humanity, not on what I represented to your financial situation." Sarah shrugged slightly. "It was the right thing to do." "The right thing," Reynolds repeated thoughtfully. "Sometimes I think corporate structures are designed specifically to distance us from that simple question. What is the right thing to do?" He turned to face her, fully. "Ms. Matthews, Sarah, what happened with your loan should never have occurred. The acquisition protocols explicitly state that existing payment plans remain in effect during transition. Someone failed to follow those protocols, and your family has suffered because of it." "You're saying it was an error?" Sarah asked, wary. "Of easy explanations, an error at best, deliberate policy circumvention at worst." Reynolds' expression hardened slightly. "Either way, it's being corrected." Hope flickered within Sarah, but she tempered it with caution. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we're not just extending your foreclosure timeline. We're reinstating your original payment plan with First Regional, with adjustments to account for the financial hardship caused by our error." Reynolds spoke with clear authority. "Jessica Chen is preparing the documentation now." Sarah absorbed this, almost afraid to believe it could be so simple. "And the missed payments from the last 3 months? Will be recalculated under the original interest rate and added to the back end of your loan term. No penalties, no immediate demands for payment." The relief was so sudden and complete that Sarah found herself momentarily speechless. If what Reynolds was saying proved true, they would not only keep the farm, but have a realistic chance of meeting their obligations going forward. "Why?" she finally managed. "Why go to these lengths? I understand correcting an error, but this level of personal involvement—" She gestured to his wheelchair. "You checked yourself out of the hospital to do this." Reynolds was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting across the orchard, trees planted by a grandfather for grandchildren not yet born, an act of faith in continuity and legacy. "When I was trapped in that car," he said at last, "fading in and out of consciousness, I had a moment of perfect clarity. I thought, this is how it ends, alone on a back road, with no one knowing or caring where I am. Then you appeared, a complete stranger, risking your safety in a storm to help someone who, unknown to you, represented a direct threat to your home." He turned back to Sarah, his expression unguarded. "In that moment, and in the hours that followed as you cared for me, I saw something I fear I've lost touch with in my professional life. The fundamental connection between human beings that transcends transaction." Sarah understood then that something profound had shifted for Alexander Reynolds during those vulnerable hours in their care, something that went beyond gratitude for medical attention or guilt over foreclosure. "Your mother," Reynolds said, "the one who taught you that kindness matters more than convenience, who believed in growing things that take time and care to cultivate. She would have understood why I'm here today." Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back. She would have. "I can't undo what happened to my grandfather's farm," Reynolds continued, "but I can ensure that your family doesn't lose its legacy because of a corporate error or because of my own failure to maintain the human element in business decisions." He extended his hand, the gesture simple but significant. "What do you say, Miss Matthews? Shall we head back and formalize this arrangement?" Sarah took his offered hand, the connection representing far more than a business agreement. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds, I think we should." As they made their way back to the farmhouse, Sarah felt a weight lifting that she had carried for months. She couldn't help but think her mother would indeed have understood the transformation that had occurred, how crisis had revealed character, how vulnerability had fostered connection, and how a single act of compassion had altered the trajectory of all their lives. As Sarah and Reynolds returned to the farmhouse, she noticed additional vehicles had arrived. 2 more sleek sedans and a van with the Reynolds Financial logo emblazoned on its side. A small group of professionally dressed individuals stood conversing with Marcus Whitfield on the front lawn, creating an incongruous scene against the backdrop of the weathered farm buildings and storm-damaged fields. "I wasn't expecting a full corporate delegation," Sarah remarked, pulling the utility vehicle to a stop. "I may have set a few additional wheels in motion while you were showing me around," Reynolds admitted, a hint of something like anticipation in his expression. Robert Matthews emerged from the house, followed by Jessica Chen. Sarah could read nothing in her father's expression, a careful neutrality that he had perfected through years of negotiations with banks, suppliers and buyers. He approached as the medical attendant helped Reynolds back into his wheelchair. "Everything all right?" Sarah asked her father quietly. "More than all right," Robert replied, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of emotion. "Ms. Chen has been explaining the revised loan terms." Reynolds nodded to Whitfield, who stepped forward, gesturing toward the newcomers. "Ms. Matthews, Mr. Matthews, I'd like to introduce some colleagues who will be integral to what we're proposing. This is David Patterson, our Director of Community Banking Initiatives, Sophia Mendez, Head of Agricultural Investment, and Thomas Wright, our Chief Legal Officer." Each nodded in greeting, their expressions professionally cordial but revealing nothing of their purpose. Sarah felt a ripple of uncertainty. This level of corporate presence seemed excessive for a simple loan restructuring. "Let's continue our discussion inside," Reynolds suggested. "I believe we have much to cover." Once they had all settled in the Matthews living room, Reynolds took control of the meeting with a quiet authority that belied his injured state. "Mr. and Ms. Matthews, as I explained to Sarah during our tour, we're correcting the error regarding your loan terms, reinstating your original payment plan with adjustments to address the hardship caused by our mistake." He nodded to Chen, who distributed folders to Sarah and Robert. "These documents formalize that arrangement." Sarah opened the folder, scanning the terms with cautious hope. Everything appeared as Reynolds had described, their previous interest rate restored, missed payments recalculated, and added to the end of the loan term. No penalties for the period of non-payment. It seemed almost too straightforward a solution. "After months of bureaucratic roadblocks, this addresses our immediate concern," she acknowledged, "and we're grateful. But I'm curious why it requires the presence of your executive team." Reynolds smiled slightly. "Perceptive, as I've come to expect. You're right, there's more to discuss. What happened with your loan wasn't an isolated incident. Our internal review has identified 17 other farms in this region that were similarly affected during the acquisition transition." Robert leaned forward. "The Hendersons? The Whitakers?" "Among others, yes," Reynolds confirmed. "All are having their original loan terms reinstated immediately. My legal team is contacting each affected property owner today." Sarah exchanged a glance with her father, both processing the implications. Their neighbors and friends, fellow farmers who had been struggling with the same sudden increase in payments, would also find relief. The communal impact of this correction would ripple throughout their agricultural community. "That's significant," Sarah said carefully. "Thank you for addressing it so comprehensively." "It's only the beginning," Reynolds replied, a note of determination entering his voice. "The error has revealed a fundamental flaw in our approach to agricultural lending, particularly as it relates to family farms with generational roots." He gestured to Sophia Mendez, who opened her laptop. "Ms. Mendez has been developing a new initiative called Roots and Returns, a new framework for agricultural partnership. Today we're launching it with Willow Creek Farm as our first participant." As Mendez outlined the program, Sarah listened with increasing amazement. Reynolds Financial was proposing a complete reimagining of how banks engaged with family farms, offering sustainable infrastructure investments, marketing partnerships, with major food buyers and technical support, while honoring the traditional wisdom of multi-generational farmers. In essence, Mendez concluded, we want to become partners in your success, not just creditors demanding payment regardless of agricultural conditions. David Patterson stepped in. For Willow Creek Farm, specifically, we're proposing not just loan restructuring, but a comprehensive partnership that includes capital for infrastructure improvements and guaranteed purchasing contracts through our corporate clients in the restaurant and healthcare sectors. Sarah's mind raced with the possibilities. What's the catch? Robert asked bluntly, the wariness of a farmer who had seen too many too-good-to-be-true proposals. Reynolds addressed the question directly. Transparency and commitment. Participating. Farms agree to open book accounting with our agricultural advisors, compliance with sustainability metrics we jointly establish, and quality standards. In exchange, we provide financial tools, market access, and technical support. He leaned forward, in his wheelchair, his expression earnest. Mr. Matthews, I won't pretend this is pure altruism. Reynolds' financial benefits from stable, successful agricultural clients, but it's designed as a genuine partnership where both sides have concrete advantages. As the meeting continued, Thomas Wright, the previously silent legal representative, spoke up. There's one more element to address. Ms. Matthews, we understand you recently missed a job opportunity due to the circumstances of Mr. Reynolds' accident. Whitfield extracted another document. Riverside County General is expanding their rural health outreach program and seeking someone with both medical training and agricultural knowledge to serve as a community health coordinator. The position offers excellent compensation, with the added advantage of being based locally. The director is eager to interview you should you wish to explore the opportunity. Sarah stared at the job description, overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. The role seemed perfectly aligned with her unique combination of skills and would provide the additional income they needed, while allowing her to remain connected to the farm. Why are you doing all this? She asked Reynolds directly. The loan. Correction, I understand. Even the agricultural program makes business sense, but this level of personal involvement. Reynolds considered her question carefully. When I was lying in your guest room, I overheard something. You and your father were discussing whether to continue helping me even after you discovered who I was. You said, Mom would say how we treat people when they're vulnerable shows who we really are. He glanced around the room at his assembled team before returning his gaze to Sarah and Robert. I want Reynolds Financial to embody that principle, to be an institution that responds to vulnerability with support rather than exploitation. What you've shown me has transformed not just my personal outlook, but my vision for my company's future. 1 year later. The autumn sun cast a golden glow across Willow Creek Farm as Sarah adjusted the banner stretched across the entrance to their new farm store. Community Harvest Festival, celebrating 1 year of roots and returns. The once quiet farm hummed with activity as local families arrived for the celebration. Children raced between hay bales and pumpkin displays while their parents sampled products from the dozen family farms now participating in the Reynolds Financial Agricultural Partnership Program. Sarah watched from the porch as her father led a tour of their new high-efficiency irrigation system, installed with capital from the Sustainability Fund. His arthritis had improved considerably since the reduced physical strain and stress of their new arrangement, and the pride in his voice as he explained regenerative farming practices to interested visitors was unmistakable. Quite a transformation, a familiar voice observed beside her. Sarah turned to find Alexander Reynolds approaching, using a cane, but otherwise fully recovered from his injuries. Mr. Reynolds, She greeted him warmly. "I didn't realize you'd arrived just in time for your father's irrigation lecture," he replied with a smile. "Second time I've heard it, and it's still fascinating." They stood in companionable silence, observing the festival that represented far more than a seasonal celebration. It was tangible proof of a new model of relationship between financial institutions and the communities they served. "The hospital. It tells me your rural health program has been remarkably successful," Reynolds commented. "3 new satellite clinics in farming communities that previously had limited access to healthcare." Sarah nodded, pride evident in her expression. "We're reaching people who had fallen through the cracks for years. The combination of medical care and agricultural education is making a real difference in health outcomes." In the distance, they could see Marcus Whitfield deep in conversation with the Henderson family, who had recently become the 20th farm to join the Roots and Returns program. What had begun as a small pilot had expanded throughout the region, attracting national attention and inspiring similar initiatives at other financial institutions. "I received a call from the Secretary of Agriculture yesterday," Reynolds mentioned, casually. "They're interested in developing federal guidelines based on our model." Sarah raised an eyebrow, impressed. From local error to national policy in 1 year, not bad. A bell rang, signaling the start of the harvest feast. Community members began gravitating toward the long tables set up beneath the old apple trees, laden with dishes prepared from local farm products. "Will you join us?" Sarah asked. "My father would love to show you the heirloom apple varieties we've revived this season." Reynolds nodded. "I'd like that." As they walked toward the gathering, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed not just her family's circumstances, but an entire community's relationship with the financial institutions that held their futures. In the balance, a single act of compassion during a storm had rippled outward in ways she could never have imagined that desperate night. What had seemed like the darkest moment for Willow Creek Farm had become the catalyst for renewal. Not just for her family, but for every farmer whose weathered hands had taken up Reynolds' offer of genuine partnership. Her gaze fell on the small memorial garden where her mother was buried, now blooming with fall chrysanthemums. Emma Matthews had always believed that doing the right thing, even at personal cost, would ultimately bear fruit in unexpected ways. Never had that wisdom been more powerfully demonstrated than in the thriving community now breaking bread together, beneath trees planted by generations past and preserved for generations yet to come. Reynolds noticed her glance toward the memorial garden. "She would be proud," he said quietly, "of what you've built here." "Of what we've built together," Sarah corrected him. "Sometimes the greatest harvests come from the most unexpected seeds." As they joined the community feast, the late afternoon sun illuminated the banner once more. Community Harvest Festival, celebrating 1 year of Roots and Returns. But beneath the formal title, someone had added a handwritten phrase that captured the true spirit of what had blossomed at Willow Creek Farm. From a single act of kindness, a community transformed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.